Hi everyone, I want to talk to you today a little bit about how our schooling system has more of a remedial focus than a strengths focused or a positive psychology focused, and why it's important that we make that shift. And so I want to start off by sharing a little bit of a story around animal school, and this is an abridged version of the story, so bear with me. In the inaugural year of animal school, it included a duck, a fish, a squirrel, and a rabbit. And the subjects that the curriculum involved were swimming, running, tree climbing, and flying. Day one of animal school, and the teacher announces that, kids, today we're doing running races. And the rabbit is super excited. I mean, this is just amazing for him. He's like, wow, this is amazing. I love school. Why didn't anybody tell me that school is so much fun? I get to do what I love every day. And of course, Rabbit absolutely shoots the lights out. He thrives, his energy's up, and the teacher is congratulating him. The teacher says to him, well done, Rabbit, you really got a talent for this running. And if you work hard at this, you can be even better. The fish was having a lot of difficulty with the running, as you can imagine. And the squirrel did okay, probably enough to pass and scrape by, but he certainly wasn't shooting the lights out. And the duck was struggling. But the duck, she was competitive. And so she hated losing. And so whenever she felt that she was falling behind, she would flap her wings to get extra speed and overtake everybody and win the race. And the teacher said to her afterwards, pointed out to her that the rules clearly state that any animals with wings are not allowed to use their wings during running races. And so, going forward, she was not allowed to use her wings. But alas, every time they had a running race and Duck was falling behind, her competitive nature wouldn't allow her to just finish second. And so she'd flap her wings and win the race. And at the end of this, the teacher was definitely convinced that she had a delinquent on her hands. This was clearly someone who had a complete disregard for the rules. And she would need to pay a lot of attention to this and possibly introduce some sort of punishment to bring Duck into line. Fish, it was decided by the teacher, needed to go into the remedial running school, because if he continued how he had started, he definitely was not going to pass the year. At the end of the school day, and all the parents came to fetch the kids, and first up were Rabbit's parents, and the teacher was telling them how amazing Rabbit had done and what a good runner he was and what potential he had, what talent he had. And so the energy was really high, and Rabbit was super excited, and his parents were really proud. And then Fish's parents arrived to fetch him, and the teacher pulled them aside and said, look, Fish is really struggling with this running, and I suggest that we put him into the remedial class, because we're going to have to work really hard if he's got any chance of passing this year. And so there was a bit of a somber mood in the Fish family. Squirrel's parents came and fetched him. There wasn't much said there, but Squirrel wasn't all that excited either. But when Duck's parents came to fetch her, the teacher called the parents aside and said, listen, your child is a delinquent. She doesn't listen. She's got a clear disregard for the rules. She's disobedient. And we're going to have to introduce some sort of discipline to pull her into line unless this behavior changes. That evening in the Rabbit household, the mood was jubilant. They were all happy and excited, and Rabbit went to bed really struggling to sleep because of the enthusiasm and excitement and the anticipation for day two. The Fish household was a little bit more somber. They'd had a quiet heart-to-heart. The parents had a quiet heart-to-heart with Fish, just explaining that and asking Fish where they could help and support so that he could improve his running ability. But in the Duck family, things were a little bit more tense. Duck got sent to bed with no food because of her bad behavior that day. Day 2, the kids arrive, and the teacher said, all right, today, kids, today is swimming lessons. And Rabbit was like, no ways. He was horrified. His face dropped. He's like, there's no ways. Rabbits don't swim. My parents don't swim. They've never learned how to swim. It's not what we do. And the teacher said, I understand that's how you feel now, but everyone needs to learn to swim, and in 5 years' time, your perspective will be different. Rabbit wasn't convinced about this. And the teacher instructed all the kids to jump into the pool. And Rabbit couldn't bring himself to jumping into the pool. Of course, Duck and Fish were happy enough and very comfortable to be in water. And eventually the teacher had to go up to Rabbit and pushed him in. And he went under, and then he came up, and then he went under, and then he came up, and then he went under, and bubbles came up. And the teacher had to dive in and save him. And when she pulled him out, he was all wet, and his fur was all flat and stuck to him. And all the other animals pointed and laughed at Rabbit and said how funny he looked. It looked hilarious to them because they said he looked like a rat without a tail. Poor old Rabbit was deeply humiliated. Deeply humiliated. He just wanted to be somewhere else. He wanted to just run away. He felt so embarrassed and just so small. At the end of that day, it was decided by the teacher that Rabbit and Squirrel needed to be in the remedial swimming class. And this was against the backdrop of Duck and Fish getting all the accolades for the day. And of course, when the parents came to fetch them, Duck's parents and Fish's parents got raving reviews, but Squirrel and Rabbit's parents were called aside and told that their kids were in the remedial class. And Rabbit in particular, his parents were pulled aside and told that Rabbit clearly had a resistance to learning to swim. He clearly showed no commitment to wanting to learn. And if he didn't learn, and he didn't work hard at this, and didn't change his attitude towards it, he was definitely not going to pass the year. And what the teacher suggested was that they substitute Rabbit's running classes for extra swimming classes, because she felt that was really needed in order to help get him through the year without failing. And so you can see where the story goes, and each day Rabbit went into school, got more of what he hated, more of what drained him, more of the things that broke his confidence down because he just wasn't naturally strong at that. And every day his resistance to school and his hate for school increased and his confidence decreased. And you can see where this heads. And so our schooling system, while there have been some changes and have been some advancements, and there are some incredible teachers, generally and predominantly, the schooling system tends to have more of a focus on remedial than it does on strengths. It tends to focus more on the areas where a child has weaknesses or deficits rather than where they excel. And so if you as a kid got A's and B's in all your subjects, but you got a D in math, guess where you got the extra lesson? Guess where the focus was on maths. How do we get you to be better in math? Instead of saying, hey, you know what? You're really great in art, or you're really creative in something else. How do we really maximize that? And so what we've done through this approach in our society is we've conditioned people to be what they're not. We've put square pegs in round holes. And even in a work environment, what happens? In a work environment, most companies, a lot of companies, you have your review and they call you aside, and your boss or your person you report to, your line manager, calls you aside and says, all right, you're really doing well here and here and here, but this is where you lack, all right? And HR pulls you in and they put a whole development plan together to to close the gaps, a gap analysis. And so constantly we are our society is focusing on rounding the edges, on ignoring the strengths and focusing on fixing the weaknesses. And the result of that is we become average at everything, rather than stand out in the things that really energize us. Today, Gallup's State of the Workplace report shows that only 2 out of 10 people are actively engaged in the work that they do. And if we had to imagine this now, based on the report that Gallup have done in the workplace, and how many people, as a result, are really actively engaged in what they do, and we had to represent that on a bicycle, it would look something like this. You've got 1 or 2 people who are actively engaged. They love what they do. The majority of what they do every day energizes them and plays to their strengths. And they are working to drive the business forward. And then you've got 5 or 6 people who are disengaged. They just come to work, they do what they have to do. If they can get out of it and they can pretend like they can look like they're productive even when they're not really, then that's okay. And so they look busy, but they're not productive. And then you've got 1 or 2 people who are actively disengaged. They hate work so much that they are trying to put a spanner in the works. They are actively working against the company, actively working to try and derail the productivity and the success. And we've got to ask ourselves, where does this come from? Where does this mindset start? And while I don't want to put the whole blame and the whole responsibility on our schooling system, it is important to note that our schooling system and the foundation of our schooling system was really developed in the industrial age for a very, very, very different time. And the whole focus and the whole shift from remedial to focusing on strengths, the seeds of this idea were spawned in the 1950s. Dr. Donald Clifton, an educational psychologist, conducted what became known as the famous Nebraska School Project. He wanted to see if by improving people's reading speed, it would have a positive impact on education. And he felt that a person's reading speed was a cornerstone to education. And so what he and his team did was they gathered together a whole lot of students. And they tested their reading speed to get a benchmark. And there were 2 main groups that emerged. There were the group that were reading around 90 to 120 words a minute. And then there was another group that were reading, a smaller group, that were reading around 250 to 300 words a minute. All with high levels of comprehension. And then the idea was to put them all through several weeks of speed reading training and then retest them to see how that had changed. Everybody that was involved in the experiment, in conducting and facilitating the experiment, was absolutely convinced that the group that would see the biggest change would obviously be the slower group because they had more room to improve. How much faster can you get? How much faster can you read when you're already reading at 250 to 300 words a minute? And so they put them all through a speed reading training, and then they retested them. And the results shocked them. The slower group that were reading around 90 to 120 words a minute had now improved, and they were reading in the region of 150 to 170 words a minute. But the group that were already reading faster, the group that were already reading at 250 to 300 words a minute, were now reading at over 2,500 words a minute. And the results were so shocking and unexpected that they questioned the validity of the experiment. They questioned whether they had, just by chance, got a whole bunch of outliers in that group. And so what they did was they redid the experiment. They repeated the experiment in a different educational district with a different group of students. And the results that they got were very, very similar. And that was where the very first seeds of the idea that when you invest time, effort, and energy into building natural strengths, you get exponential growth. Whereas if you invest time, the same amount of time, effort, and energy into fixing a weakness, if you're lucky, you get a slight increase. It's a slight increase versus an exponential. It's incremental versus exponential. So what is positive psychology? Well, in the 80s, Dr. Martin Seligman, a psychologist, did a PhD. And that paper, he called on his colleagues in the field and he said to them, fellow psychologists, he said, psychology is predominantly focused on pathology, on what's wrong with someone. What are their disorders? What's dysfunctional? And how to treat that. And he said, that is needed, and we've advanced a long way with our understanding of psychological pathology and dysfunction. And there are people who need that help. But he said what is missing is a focus on what makes people thrive. What's right about people? Where are they strong? You can't deal with happiness you can't understand happiness by studying sadness. You can't understand success by understanding failure. You can't learn about how people thrive when you're studying what inhibits that, what makes them deteriorate. And so he said that he was going to dedicate his career towards what makes human beings thrive. And some others joined him on that journey, and that became known as positive psychology. When you ask somebody, what is a strength? Most people will say, well, a strength is something you're good at. And if you had to ask most people, what is a weakness? They are likely to say, well, a weakness is something you're not good at. And this is typically how, in conventional society, we define a strength and a weakness. But actually, a strength and a weakness have very little to do with this. This has to do with a skill. Something you're good at is a skill. If you have a skill in a particular area, you're good at it. And if you don't have a skill in that particular area, you're not good at it. And so what we're talking about when we say something you're good at versus something you're not good at is really skill. Skill is something that you're good at. So what is a strength then? Well, a strength is something that strengthens you. If you for a moment just think about the things that you do, that you love doing, that energize you. In the case of Rabbit, that was running. And running made Rabbit feel strong because it gave Rabbit energy. That's a strength. A weakness is something that weakens you. So in the case of Rabbit, swimming was a weakness because it made Rabbit feel drained. It broke Rabbit's confidence. And so when you think about the things that weaken you, what are the things that cost you energy versus the things that give you energy? Think about your day. Think about the things you do. What are the things that, time flies by, you feel energized versus the things that drain you? This is really a better way to start thinking about a strength and a weakness. You see, a strength is really the overlapping of knowledge, skill, experience, and natural drive. This is a strength. If we take knowledge and look at that, right, having the knowledge, which is knowing what to do, isn't a strength. That just gives you the knowledge. Having the skill, which is the ability to do something well, that's also not a strength. Because we can build knowledge and skill, arguably, in any area we choose. Experience is the time, the effort, and the energy that you invest. And that, too, can be something anyone can do. So knowledge, skill, and experience is not unique. Everyone can acquire knowledge, skill, and experience. But knowledge, skill, and experience does create an ability. If you have the knowledge, the skill, and the experience, you have the ability to do something. And you can build ability anywhere. A drive is natural need and natural energy. Think about need, all right? That's where we have natural drives, that's where we're drawn to those things. We love the things. If we had the opportunity to do that activity more, or whatever it is more, we would be there. We don't need encouragement. We just need the opportunity, and we're there. So we're drawn to it because it energizes us. So whenever the need is met, we get to do what we love. In the case of rabbits, that would be running. Right? There's a need to run, and he loves it. And so when he's running, what happens is his energy is unlocked. It energizes him. The very act of doing it energizes him. So need and energy gives us sustainability, because the more we do it, the more energy we get. The more energy we get, the more we do it. And so we can be sustainable in that. Versus the things that drain us, in Rabbit's case, swimming. His energy drops. He hates it. And when he's doing it, think about times where you're doing something and you love it and your energy is higher at the end than it was at the beginning. Often time disappears versus the things you hate doing. And even if you started off with high energy, your energy just drops off. And it actually costs you energy. So because it costs you energy, it's not sustainable. So where we have drainers, we don't have sustainability. Where we have drives, we have sustainability. Now let's look at another thing, a well-managed drive. All right, drive is need and energy. So a well-managed drive becomes a strength because you are complementing that drive with the appropriate knowledge, skill, and experience, and therefore it becomes a strength. A mismanaged drive becomes a detriment. Let's for a moment use an analogy. Take a hammer, and if you gave that hammer to a little small toddler, well, guess what's going to happen? The toddler is going to hurt themselves, or they're going to do some sort of damage. It's not the hammer that's the problem, it's the toddler's lack of knowledge, skill, and experience on how to use the hammer that's the problem. And what you'll find is that mismanaged drives, like a hammer in the hands of a toddler, become problematic. But add the right knowledge, skill, and experience, take that hammer and put it in the hands of a skilled artisan, and now it becomes a powerful tool. When we are young, for the most part, we are still learning about ourselves. We are still learning to manage ourselves. And therefore, for the most part, our natural drives are not well managed. And therefore, the negative aspect of those drives tends to play out and is often times more visible than the positive aspect of those drives. And the terrible shame is that we see that as negative behavior and we punish that behavior instead of recognizing that behavior as the building blocks of strengths, and then helping that child learn to redirect that need and energy in a more positive way. Now, where do our drives come from? Well, the age-old question, is it nature or is it nurture or is it a little bit of both? Well, things have changed over the years as our understanding of the brain and our nervous system and the development of our nervous system has improved through sciences like neuroscience. It was originally thought that by sort of mid-teens, our wiring was who we were, and it was kind of stable there. But things have changed since then. Now, we come into life and we have certain natural inclinations. For those of you who are parents or work with small kids, you'll know that particularly small kids, before they've had time, before society's had time to shape them or influence them, or before you as a parent have had any chance to kind of shape them, each kid comes into life with their own stuff, their own natural inclinations. No two kids are exactly the same. And that's very much nature. But then, as we go through life, the nurture part starts to happen. We get shaped by upbringing, we get shaped by the things we learn, we get shaped by people around us, parents, teachers, etc. According to neuroscience, our level of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to rewire itself, is very, very high. And it was originally thought that that high level of neuroplasticity kind of tapered off around mid to late teens. And then, who you were was who you were. But the latest findings show that that high level of neuroplasticity can last right through to mid-20s. And the interesting thing is that a person's attitude towards growth, to the extent a person has a growth mindset and maintains a growth mindset, they can still maintain fairly high levels of neuroplasticity. So are your drives locked in? I don't think so. However, that being said, if anyone's ever been to a high school reunion and seen people that you haven't seen for a really, really long time, how much have they really changed? Probably not too much. And so our drives really do become a lot more stable somewhere between mid-teens and mid-20s. Can they change? I think they can, but I would say under certain circumstances. If you've had a really life-changing experience, I think things could change. If you have been exposed to a prolonged set of circumstances, I think things could change. Or if you intentionally grow in a particular area, I think things can change. But outside of those areas, our drives really do become quite stable. And once we have a drive, we never lose a drive. We might be able to strengthen other drives, but we never lose those drives. So let's look at the drive framework. We've specifically chosen language that is archetypal. Language that when you read it, when you look at that word contemplator, or you look at the word articulator, caretaker, moderator, navigator, these words are archetypes. I don't have to tell you what a navigator is about. I don't have to tell you what a caretaker is about or what an innovator is all about. Because just the name is so archetypal and so universal that everyone's going to get a clear picture about what that is. And we have specifically chosen names for the drives to paint a very accurate and clear picture about what that drive is all about. So let's look at some of these drives and let's go back to the school environment. Because when kids are young, for the most part, there might be more mismanagement of their drives than good management of their drives. And as a result, sometimes what that can mean is the negative aspect of the drive might show up at least as much, sometimes more, than the positive aspect of the drive. All right, so let's take contemplator. And if you're a parent, think about this from a parenting context. If you're a teacher or somebody, an educator, think about it in the context of the classroom. Have you seen that kid that just seems to be in their own world? And when you ask them what they're thinking, they can't give you an answer. They struggle to communicate it. Have you seen that kid that at the tea breaks, they're the ones that choose to go and sit on their own? And other kids might feel sorry for them. Or you as a teacher or as a parent might feel sorry for them because they're on their own and nobody wants to be left out. Well, contemplators do. Because contemplators have a need for alone time. And they're deep thinkers. They like to take something and think about it deeply, looking at it from all different angles to understand something more conceptually. They're great at conceptualizing. They're great at philosophizing. They're great at strategizing. And they're great at deep learning. Because that contemplative thought process really goes deep. Why they struggle to communicate what they're thinking sometimes is because they are non-linear thinkers. And verbal communication is linear. So it's really difficult to take non-linear thoughts and communicate them in a verbal way. Not only that, but they don't have a natural need to communicate that. So sometimes it's really hard to know what's going on with them. When they're alone, they have these conversations with themselves, and sometimes and those conversations are designed to help them look at things from all different angles. sometimes that can lead them to disconnect and zone out of everything that's going on around them. And they could be labeled as loners, daydreamers, or such like, bad communicators. Now let's look at the moderator. Have you got one of those kids that just plays to the rules? Everything must go based on the rules. They're very compliant. If the rule says that, they stick to that, and they get really annoyed with other people who don't follow the rules. And when other kids don't follow the rules, they will go and tell them they need to follow the rules. They're very focused on fairness, and they want everyone to feel heard. And their approach to fairness is that everyone must feel heard and everyone must get a chance. And so it's important that the rules are clear. It's important that if they're going to play a game, that everyone understands the rules of the game and everyone plays fairly to those rules. And sometimes those moderators, when it's mismanaged, can come across really, really inflexible, really rigid when it comes to rules. They also might tend to avoid conflict or even shut down in conflict, potentially when that conflict is very direct, because they like calm and stability and they like routine and working in a systematic way. Take skeptic, right? Have you got that child that in your class who every time you say something questions you? How do you know that? Where did you get that information from? Questions you, what if this happened or what if that happened? Have you got that child in your class who always tends to point out what can go wrong? The problems, the issues, the negatives, the risks, right? Because this is what skeptics do naturally. They have got a radar for risk, but sometimes that can come across as being negative or pessimistic. What about visionary? The person, that child that just dreams. This is the real dreamer. They dream up these elaborate imaginary things and they get lost in their imaginary world. And they think about the future and they're coming up with all of these things. And sometimes that means they disconnect from what's happening now because their mind has traveled forward into the future. And because they're living in the future, sometimes they can get really irritated with what's going on in the now, or, as I say, completely disconnected with it. If they have a moment and you look around and you see that kid and they're staring out there into space, they're in their imagination. What about articulator? Have you got that chatterbox? You know, that kid that chats all the time and they never stop talking? All right? Because articulators have a need to verbalize their thoughts. They actually think aloud. In order for them to process what you're saying, they have to say it. So if you as a teacher say something, they will often repeat back what you've said in their own words. And they have a need to do that because that's their way of actually thinking. Whereas your contemplators will internalize that. But sometimes articulators, when it's mismanaged, an articulator can come across as just verbose, too much talking. What about the enthusiast? Enthusiasts are natural optimists. They have boundless energy and they have a need to express that energy. They inject energy and enthusiasm into everything that they do. And here's the most important part. They experience life in a very magnified way. They experience their emotions in a very magnified way. So when they're happy, they are super happy. And when they're excited, they're super excited. And when they're sad, they're really sad. And when they're angry, they're really angry. That magnification of their emotion can cause them to be quite overbearing and loud and over the top and dramatic. And that can be the negative side of enthusiasts. Think about how you relate to that. Supporters or includers, let's go to includer. Includer is that person that's always looking to pull the outsider in. If a new kid joins the class, they'll be the first one to go and welcome them and pull them in and befriend them. Includers hate to be left out. So they really struggle emotionally when they are excluded from a game. And you might see that playing out. They might come and tell you as a teacher and say, you know, these people are always leaving me out because they've got such a resistance to being left out, because the whole energy and need of this drive is about inclusivity. Supporter Supporters are the first ones to say, yes, sure, I'll help. Yes, sure, I'll do this. And sometimes their need to please can be linked to their self-worth. That they feel that if they are pleasing everybody and everyone's happy with them and they're saying yes to everybody and they're helping and they're supporting everybody, then everyone likes them. But if someone doesn't like them, they can take that very personally. Or if they do work at school and you give them some constructive critical feedback, they can take that very personally because they invest so much of who they are into the work that they do. And so it feels to them like you're not criticizing my work, you're criticizing me, and they can tend to take that very personally. And then lastly, captain. That's the outspoken one. Captains have a strong need to share their opinions. And they have strong opinions because captain is a very dominant drive. These are the kids that are very clinical. They don't get lost in emotions, and they're not overly sensitive when it comes to emotions. They're quite clinical and they're quite direct. When they think something, they say it because they have a need to express that. What's often misunderstood about captains is that, from other people's perspective, is that if people don't agree with what they've said, they actually want the pushback. If you don't agree with what I've said, tell me what you think, and let's have this very direct back and forth, because it's not about us fighting, it's about our ideas and opinions fighting. So they can be labeled opinionated, outspoken, and confrontational. And that can be sometimes the negative aspect of the captain drive. And what's so important is to start noticing where these show up. Because in young kids and even young adults, very often you'll see a lot more the negative, mismanaged side of a drive rather than the positive side. And it's easy to then focus on that from a pathological perspective or from a remedial perspective and make it wrong and focus on what you need to do to change that. But if you can recognize, even if it is the negative side of the drive, if you can start to recognize that actually that is the building block of a strength. And if you can help to direct that need and energy in a positive direction, you can really help someone thrive. And it is when we engage our natural drives, it's when we get appreciated for who we are rather than made to feel like we should be something we're not. That is really where we thrive. And that's where we feel good about ourselves. And that plays into our whole emotional, psychological, and even physical well-being. And it's so important to not look at them through the pathological filter, but look at them through the filter of the building blocks of strengths, and then help those kids and redirect them to really learn how to manage them and how to engage them in a positive way to really build strengths. Because remember, a drive doesn't make a strength on its own. A drive just brings natural need, natural energy. What makes a strength is when we complement a drive with knowledge, skill, and experience. If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking it's stupid. But if you help that fish to understand that tree climbing is not its thing, but it can be a great swimmer, and you channel that fish's need and energy towards swimming, that's where it finds purpose, confidence, and that's where it will thrive. And the same is true for human beings.